Thank you. Well, I'm sure some of you will be disappointed that Dr. Michael Green is not speaking here today. Just to assure you, he's speaking this evening on the theme of the search for happiness, and he'll be back in Harness lunchtime tomorrow, speaking about sex, love, and power. And then on Friday, keynote presentation on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is central to the Christian message. I suppose the reason I was asked to speak on this subject, we probably all face some adversity or other, but my only daughter, who's about your age, died about 20 years ago. So I've experienced that. My mother died when I was a relatively young man, of brain cancer. And I myself have spent 5 days in intensive care after picking up a bug in Africa which nearly killed me off. So you may have had little or much adversity in life, but that's my personal part of the personal story. We could see from the DVD there that suffering is pretty universal, and it's hard to find anybody these days who hasn't experienced some adversity of one kind or another. But I'm going to read to you now a little short passage from a book in the Old Testament of the section of the Bible, which entirely deals with one man's facing up to the challenge of suffering and adversity in his life. The reason I'm going to read this passage is because even though it fits in the middle of the Old Testament, it's probably, I don't have time to go into the reasons for this, it's probably the oldest book in the Bible. And the reason I'm reading it is because it highlights that the issue of suffering was a question which men and women have grappled with since the beginning of time. So it's not a recent phenomenon. It's from the story of Job, and it's chapter 1. I'll just read the first few verses and then the last 10 of the chapter. There was a man named Job living in the land of Uz who worshipped God and was faithful to him. He was a good man, careful not to do anything evil. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 1,000 cattle, 500 donkeys. He also had a large number of servants and was the richest man in the East. One day when Job's children were having a feast at the home of their eldest brother, a messenger came to Job, and he said, "We were ploughing the fields with the oxen and the donkeys in a nearby pasture, and suddenly the Sabeans," that's a ethnic group, "attacked and stole them all. They killed every one of your servants except me. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you." Before he had finished speaking, a second servant came and said, "Lightning struck the sheep and the shepherds and killed them all. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you." Before he had finished, a third person came and said, "3 bands of Chaldeans," that's another tribal group, raiders, "attacked us, took away the camels and killed all your servants except me. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you." Before he had finished, a fourth person came and said, "Your children were having a feast in the house of your eldest son when a storm swept in from the desert, blew the house down, killed them all. I'm the only one who's escaped to tell you." Then Job stood up, tore his clothes in grief. He shaved his head and threw himself face downwards on the ground and said, "I was born with nothing, I'll die with nothing. The Lord gave, and now he has taken away. May his name be praised." And in spite of everything that had happened to Job, he did not sin, blaming God. Well, for some people this is an intellectual question, but for many of us, as I mentioned, it's an existential or a felt question. Intellectually, it is more often a problem for people, a barrier in terms of coming to trust the God of the Bible, if they've grown up in the Western world. And this is because of the concept, even if we're not Christians at all, that we've grown up with in terms of how we understand the nature of the Christian God. There are 4 distinctives about the God of the Bible which lead us to have questions about the goodness of God and the reality of suffering in the world. The first is the Bible teaches there's only one God, whereas in Hinduism there are 43,000 million gods. I don't say that in cynicism. It's just if there's only one God, why does that one God allow suffering and good things? If there are many gods, maybe some are bad, some are good. Secondly, the Bible says that God is a personal God, whereas in Islam, God is impersonal. He's unknowable. If God is personally interested in us, why should he allow these things to happen to us? In Islam, many Muslims say, Inshallah, it's the will of God, it's not to be questioned. Thirdly, the Christian concept of God is that he's almighty. He can do anything. He can change events. So why doesn't he stop suffering when it occurs in our lives? And then perhaps paramountly, fourth of all, the Bible uniquely reveals God as a loving Father. This is only found in the Bible. You look in vain to find it in the Quran, for example. So if he's a loving Father, why would he allow this to happen to his children? Now, I want to suggest that from a Christian perspective, my own contention is that I think the Christian worldview and the Bible gives the most satisfying answers to the big questions that we face in life. It doesn't always give us an exhaustive answer, everything we want to know in answer, but it gives sufficient in order to believe. And what we're challenging folks to do this week is to ask three questions as we try to present the Christian faith and the person of Jesus Christ and apply it to some of the big questions, is to ask, if you will please reflect yourself on three questions. Could this be true? Could it be relevant to the questions I'm asking? And is it more satisfying than an alternative worldview? Some people have tried to give alternative answers. Albert Camus, the famous French existentialist, just gave up on this one, as did most 20th century philosophers, and he talked about the hopeless encounter between mankind and suffering. He had no answer to the question at all. Muslims say, Inshallah, it's the will of God, as I've said. Baudelaire, the French philosopher, said, well, some people argue the world has always been like this. And he said, if it's always been like this, and if there's a God, he must be a devil. Must be the devil, because there's so much that's wrong in the world. Richard Dawkins says, well, it's just blind, pitiless indifference of DNA. He doesn't offer any solution. It's like the luck of the draw. Well, some people have argued that ignorance is the problem, is one of the key problems with suffering, and certainly knowledge can help us relieve suffering, but it doesn't actually solve it. So what is the biblical perspective and response to the issue of suffering? I want to try to answer three questions. What does the Bible say is the cause of suffering? Then secondly, if there's a God who is there, what's he done about it? Thirdly, what should our response be? Firstly, what does the Bible say is the source and the cause of suffering? The Bible actually teaches that all suffering is rooted in man's rebellion against God. Sin, the Bible tells us, is man trying to live independently of God, in God's world without reference to him. If you like, receiving the gifts of God without adhering to the purpose of God. And all suffering has roots in man's rebellion against God. So we see a minor key running through the whole of creation. The Bible teaches us that when God created man, it was never his intention for man to suffer. He created a perfect world with choice, but something cataclysmic has happened in the past, which Christians call the fall of men and women, and it's been repeated through individual lives thereafter, which exacerbates the problem of suffering. So though the Bible says that all suffering is due to sin, this is really important, it doesn't say that all suffering is due to personal sin. It says it comes from three sources. It's true that some suffering does come from personal sin, or self-centeredness, or selfishness. For example, the pain which issues from adulterous relationships. Some of us might have already experienced that with the breakup of the family home. Many people who have experienced, who are children of divorced parents, say it's like a bereavement. It's very painful, because perhaps of the selfish running off of one partner in the family, one of the spouses, with someone else. But in other ways also, God has given us a framework, because we are finite, so we can't do anything. We are limited by our finiteness. And he gives us the guidelines not to spoil our fun, but because he's a loving Father who knows our limits. So, for example, we can abuse those limits if we say, I want to be free to do whatever I want, even if God has created me and given a framework. Tough. I'm going to make my own choices. If they're wrong, then at least I made the choice myself. This was brought home to me some years ago in Cardiff. I have a number of friends who are consultants in the university hospital, and one of the ladies there was a consultant in her early 60s, was treating a man with nicotine poisoning. And he was a chain smoker, working through 30-40 cigarettes a day for 35 years. In his early 60s, he had nicotine poisoning in his hand, and she had to amputate 3 fingers on the hand he used for smoking. And she tried to reason with him afterwards and said, you know, if you weren't a chain smoker, you wouldn't have had this experience of losing fingers. And his response to her was, listen, girl, unfortunately he called her girl even though she was 62. He said, listen, girl, I've been smoking for 40 years and this is the first time anything's ever gone wrong. So I don't see any reason that I should stop. I suppose if we use the illustration of going up in a plane and given a parachute to jump out of the plane, one of us could say, well, I want to experiment this afternoon and jump out of the plane without the parachute. I find that an encumbrance. It's a violation of my freedom. So I'm going to take the parachute off and I'm going to leave it in the plane. Just going to check out what it's like to jump out of the plane and see what happens when I do it without any of this aid as I go down towards the earth. We're very likely to die. We're free to neglect, as it were, the Maker's instructions to us, but we would have to suffer the consequences. That's why the Bible says we reap what we sow. And often suffering is caused by that. But secondly, the Bible tells us that some suffering is caused by corporate sin or the sins of other people. For example, people get caught up in ethnic violence and wars, and it's nothing to do with them. We see some of these tensions occurring in Ukraine and Russia at the moment. I've seen it at first hand in Rwanda, where 17 years ago I saw 1 million people killed in 100 days. Perhaps the worst experience of intensive violence in any country in the world in the last century. And it was because of ethnic tensions. I remember once visiting, it's been my privilege in my working life to visit about 120 countries, many of them in the third world, perhaps 30 African, 30 Asian countries, 30 in the Americas, 30 in Europe. Once when I was traveling to India, I was in the north of the country and there'd been intensive flooding, just like we experienced recently. And there was a Christian agency that wanted to go in to help a group of villages that had been affected by the flooding. But these villages were in an area where there was known to be a very corrupt local government who siphoned off the money into the pockets of some of the leaders in positions of authority. So the Christian agency said, look, we'd really like to go and work alongside these people and help rehabilitate them and get their homes back and their lives up and running again. And some of the executives in the local authorities said, give us the money and we'll deal with it ourselves. You keep out. They said, actually, no. We'd like to work alongside the people ourselves directly. To which the leaders in the local organization or the local authority said, push off then, keep your money to yourself, let the people suffer. In other words, the suffering was caused by an inundation, by heavy rainfall, but it was exacerbated by the stupidity, selfishness, and corruption of others. Sexual abuse is often like that. It's quite common for young people who've experienced sexual abuse to blame themselves. But actually there's a difference biblically between guilt feelings, which some people experience, and true moral guilt. And in that case, often the person who has been sinned against may feel guilt feelings, but it's not their fault. Now, C.S. Lewis tried to highlight this whole question of corporate sin in his book saying, The Problem of Pain, it's man, not God, who has produced racks, whips, prisons, slavery, guns, bombs. It's by human avarice or human stupidity that we have poverty and so on. Pride, jealousy, resentment, and selfishness in the heart of man are the source of man's problems. So that's the second thing biblically. The third will be a surprise to many people, and you won't all necessarily go along with me here, but I'm going to share it because this is part of the biblical answer and picture. Actually, the Bible teaches that there is a person called Satan who's hostile to God. He knows God. We are the objects of God's affection. So just rather like a rejected lover, he tries to get back at God by introducing suffering into the lives of some of those who are his children. And this is actually what happened in the story of Job. The suffering of Job was not due to his own sin or to other people's, but to the fact that he was in a spiritual battle and there was an evil, hostile opponent to God who tried to bring suffering into his life. Now, one of the things, and actually the 42 chapters of Job are trying to unfold the thinking and reasoning behind this as Job struggles with the issue. you may well have heard of the term Job's comforters. And that's because he had 4 friends who tried to interpret and explain for him why he was suffering. And the lesson we should pick up from this is that we should be very slow to tell other people why they think they're suffering, to intervene and act as some kind of prophet. Let me tell you what the 4 guys said. Eliphaz, first of all, when Job asked him, why do you think I'm suffering? He said, well, the innocent don't suffer. So by implication, you can't be innocent. Must be your fault. Wasn't accurate. Secondly, Bildad said, well, God rewards the good. So you can't be good. It must be your fault. He was wrong. Thirdly, Zophar said, probably the creepiest of the 4, said, there must be some iniquity in your heart. Otherwise you wouldn't be suffering. And the 4th guy, Elihu, said, it's a discipline of love. All 4 of them were wrong, so the story of Job tells us. Well, that's the background. Those are the 3 sources. Still we're left with the question why. Why does God, if he's loving and a father, allow us to suffer because of personal sin? The answer I think the Bible gives us is that God has made us as human beings, as creatures with choice. If you take away the capacity to choose, you turn people into automatons. But if you give people the freedom of choice, there's always a risk in that people may respond in a way which is not beneficial to themselves or the relationship. Let me try to illustrate this. When I fell in love with my wife a number of years ago, she was very hard to catch. And I tried everything. I plied her with chocolate. She wasn't keen on flowers and various other things, taking her to the theatre. But it was very difficult to catch my wife. I had 2 options, therefore. I could have tried to woo her in various ways. Or my second option, which I thought might have been an idea worth trying out, was to come up behind her one day with a blindfold and a handkerchief and a knife in hand, put the knife in the back, in her back, my hand on her mouth and say, keep quiet or I'll knife you, put the handkerchief around her mouth and a blindfold on, dump her in the back of the boot of the car, race her off to a nearby forest where I grew up, and take her out there amongst the trees and have a priest just waiting, happen to be waiting in the trees for me, all set up. And as I bring her out of the boot of the car, with the knife still in the back, take the blind and the handkerchief off and get her to say at the appropriate point, yes, I will. I could have tried that, but it wouldn't have led to a lasting relationship or marriage, which is what we've had for the last 32 years. I had to allow her the freedom to choose lovingly to my loving overtures. And fortunately, providentially for me, that's what happened. So there's a risk in choice, but God took that risk. Secondly, though, why does he allow us to suffer because of the sins of other people? The answer to this one is different. It's because God made us as social beings. And one of the worst things in life is to be alone. I agree with Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who said, the worst disease in the world is not cancer. And I've lost 10 family members with cancer. She said, the worst disease of all is loneliness. That's why in the very first chapters of the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, God says it's not good that man should be alone. So he gave the first man a wife for companionship. I tried to experiment with this issue once myself many years ago. I'm a fairly socially gregarious, outgoing extrovert, and I decided to go off to Greece, to a Greek island on my own, which was uninhabited, for a week to see what it was like just to be on my own. I love talking and being with other people, so it was a tricky one. Anyway, I went to the island, and the boat just left me there, and I was left on the beach for the week. It was so memorable as one of the worst weeks in my entire life, just left to my own company. I needed to be engaged with other people socially, but there's a risk in it. For if we engage with other people socially, we can have a happy marriage, we can get divorced. Ukraine can have positive economic relations with Russia. They can also be invaded. Twin sisters can get on well together. They can also fight like cat and dog. I remember growing up with a couple of teenage twin sisters. They were always fighting when they were about 13, 14, 15. And their parents had two choices. They could have said to them, "You two girls are arguing so much, it's just unbearable in the home. What we're going to do is lock you in two separate bedrooms till you're through the grot of adolescence for the next 3 years. And then when you've settled down and become a bit more mature in terms of how you relate to one another, we'll take you out of the two rooms and we'll see if you can live together." I think the girls would have reacted against that. They wanted to be together. Even though they fought each other like cat and dog, if somebody attacked one of them, the other came in and defended her assiduously. So there's a risk in being social beings, but that's how God has made us, with all the benefits that come from it. Thirdly, why does he allow us to suffer? Because of the sins of Satan. Here God doesn't give a complete answer in the book of Job, which is the book that speaks most about it. As far as God goes, he says it's because we're spiritual beings. We're not just material beings living in a closed universe, but there's a spiritual dimension with a God who loves us and an enemy who hates him and the objects of his affection. Now, I realize that some of you may balk at the idea that there is such a thing as a devil. I believe that there is, simply because of my view of who Jesus Christ is. My conviction is that Jesus Christ was correct when he claimed to be God and come in human form. If he was who he claimed to be, whatever he says about any issue, whether it's the existence of the devil, the historicity of the Old Testament, sexual behavior, it must follow ipso facto that he is true and correct in what he says. And he speaks more about the existence of this hostile enemy in the Bible than anyone else does. But Satan's power is limited. The second dimension to this answer is that God tells Job, "I know the answer, but I'm not going to tell you the full answer yet. You have sufficient in order to trust me." I'm reminded, if I can use an illustration in this respect, you may think when you hear my name that, poor guy, he's got a woman's name, Lindsay. And I once asked my parents that question. Why did you give me such a difficult name to use? Also, it doesn't mean anything significant, just island pool, I think. But I remember growing up and there was a guy I knew of, and I felt even more sorry for him. I'm afraid it did encourage me when I realized his name was Tulip Scott. I don't know what his parents were thinking of when they named him that. But when he was a small boy, under 2 years of age, as you know, boys often are slower to learn to speak, he contacted smallpox. And if you've seen smallpox, especially in India, the tendency is to scratch the pock marks on the face and they leave an indelible mark there. And so his mother, for a period of time, tied his hands behind his back. He couldn't speak, so she couldn't articulate to him why this was happening. Later on in life, however, he came to understand that his mother had done this, and he said to her when he was about 15 or 16, "Why did you tie my hands behind my back when I was a small child?" She said, "Well, I couldn't explain to you at the time because you couldn't understand, but I didn't want you to hurt yourself even more by scratching the pock marks, and that's why I did it, and I waited till you were older to reveal the explanation." Well, that's as far as the biblical story goes in explaining why there is suffering. Why does God allow us to suffer? Because of personal, corporate, or Satan's sin. The second section is, what has God done about it? Because it's important to ask the question, why am I suffering or facing adversity? But you've still actually got to answer the question of, how am I going to react? And if there is a God who is there, how has he reacted? The New Testament, through the teaching of Jesus, teaches us that God the Father has done three things. They are through the cross of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, and the grace of God. Briefly, I'll comment on those. First of all, the Bible paramountly tells us that God knows what suffering is. He's acquainted with grief. It's right to be angry with suffering, but not against God. Even Jesus, when he saw that Lazarus was dead, wept because he was deeply moved, because he knew this wasn't how things were made to be. If we ask the question, why do the innocent suffer, or why do I suffer, we should ask the corollary, which is, why did the innocent one suffer, Jesus? And ask, why did God allow his own son to suffer? We certainly can't say that God doesn't know anything about suffering. Archbishop Temple, one of the great church leaders of the last century, tried to respond to this query by saying this. Some people, he said, say there cannot be a God of love, because if there was, he would look on the world and his heart would break. At which point, he said, the church points to the cross and says, but it did break. Others, he said, say it's God who made the world, he should bear the load. The church points to the cross, he said, and says, but he did. Other people may come and say, God doesn't understand what I'm going through. The church points to the cross and says, but he does. You may ask, he went on, you may ask the question, why do the innocent suffer? To which I respond, why did the innocent one suffer? Christ died not just as an example, but a means of dealing with the root problem of sin, which hinders us from a loving relationship with God, and through his substitutionary death on the cross opens up a way back to God. Now I've got two visual illustrations here I'd like you to look at in this respect from European artists. One of them is a friend of mine. She's a Swedish sculptor called Britt Willström, and she was asked by Amnesty International to produce something on the problem of suffering that they could use in their publicity. And you can see, obviously as a Christian, she's got those three poles there which give the impression of the three crosses, but it's not exactly three crosses. You have on the right hand side, it's probably a woman who has been beaten and is recoiling from being attacked. On the left hand side is probably a child who is being abused or attacked. And in the center you have someone who is experiencing the consequences of torture. But then there's a second thing here. And what she's trying to indicate really is that God understands the suffering of the world. Second image I'd like you to look at is this one by the great Dutch painter Rembrandt from the 17th century. Rembrandt here is painting a picture of Christ coming down from the cross. What is interesting about this painting, however, is if you look at the figure at the foot of the cross, it's Rembrandt himself. It's a self-portrait. Rembrandt became a Christian, follower of the Christ of the Bible. What Rembrandt is trying to say in this painting is, the reason Jesus is on the cross is because of me. I put him there. And it's because of my self-centeredness, my arrogance, my rejection of the God of the Bible, that God needed to intervene in sending down a perfect sacrifice to take upon himself the judgment I deserve, that I might be redeemed or set free. So Rembrandt is trying to communicate something here of the first part of God's answer to the problem of suffering, that ultimately can be dealt with uniquely through the cross of Jesus Christ. He's not just an example, but he's a substitute for us in a moral universe. I always remember, I think of my daughter pretty much every day. I remember going, she would be in university with some of you now. She would have been of your age. I remember going to her funeral and talking with my wife in the car on the way. And my wife just turned to me and said, you know, it's really difficult to think of your daughter, your only daughter, dying before we do. She said it's a terrible, painful experience. But she said, we still also have a son. And she said, you know what I'm thinking? What must it have been like for God the Father to give up his only son? We've lost one. We still have one. But he gave the only one he had. Why? Out of love for us. That's the first part of the answer. The second is that Jesus talked about the resurrection, the hope of the resurrection, which we'll come back to on Friday lunchtime. And he constantly warned us that building our hope and happiness in this world is short-sighted. It's very interesting if you review. I studied history and philosophy and political theory in university. It's very interesting if you compare what 20th century philosophers and others have said about facing adversity and suffering and death over against the Christian perspective. It's the one key area where the great philosophers really have nothing to say. Let me give you some quotations of some 20th century and thinkers before then. Bertrand Russell, the great English philosopher, just said, when I die, I rot. Somerset Maugham, who was probably a lapsed Roman Catholic, said death will be a hellish experience. Voltaire, who lived a couple of hundred years before, the great French deist philosopher, said death is a step into the unknown. So no answer. It's rather bleak approach to the problem of suffering and death. Compare that with the statements of some Christians in the last century and before. Martin Luther King, who was shot dead in the late 1960s. When he was shot dead and killed, his wife said, "They ended my husband's earthly existence with one bullet, but not all the bullets in all the arsenals in all the world can end his eternal existence. For my husband had hope in Christ, and I believe he is with him now." Or I think of my friend in Mozambique who used to fly single-engine Cessnas inland to poor people, and his plane went down and he was killed. Henry, his name was. And his wife, when she heard of his death, said, "When I heard of Henry's death, my heart broke into a million pieces," because Christians grieve too. We don't just treat it as inconsequential. But she said, "I am comforted by the sure and certain hope that Henry is in the presence of Christ, whom he lived for and who promised eternal life to him." And that's why we actually, on our daughter's grave, wrote a verse which is from the Old Testament. When King David lost a child, he'd been praying and fasting for the healing of this child. God didn't see fit to heal the child, and he died, just as ours did. And then David washed and brushed up, and somebody said to him, "Why aren't you still fasting and praying, and why aren't you in sackcloth and ashes?" And David said this, "He cannot come to me, but I will go to him." So we wrote on our daughter's grave, "She cannot come to us, but we will go to her because of the hope of the resurrection." Now that's founded in the Christian conviction that there is something beyond this death, that we're beyond this life. We're not in a closed universe, that there is a God who is there, that Jesus Christ bodily rose from the dead, about which we'll hear more on Friday, and he promises the hope of eternal life for those who follow him. That leads us to the vexed question of heaven and hell. And you can come back at me at that if you want afterwards. People really struggle with this because they say, well, if there's a good, loving God, why does he allow the existence of hell, where perhaps many people spend eternity? Well, the interesting thing is, some people say, I prefer the God of the Old Testament to the God of the New Testament. God of the Old Testament is judgmental, the God of the New Testament is loving. Usually that shows they haven't carefully read the Bible, because the word hell is not used in the Old Testament. Judgment is referred to, and the place of the departed, Hades, but there's very little reference to separation from God in the Old Testament. It's almost all in the New Testament. And the word that we Anglo-Saxons interpret as hell was a Greek word Gehenna, which is only mentioned 14 times in the New Testament, and big surprise, this is a whopper, of the 14 times it's mentioned, Jesus mentions it 11 times. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Why? And I think the only answer can be, our best friends and closest family, they're the only ones who will dare tell us the truth ahead of time, at the risk of being rejected. It's fair weather friends who hold back realities because they're afraid of losing the friendship or being cut out of our lives altogether. But Jesus, knowing the existence of a place where people are separated from God, spoke openly about it. Hell, by definition, is really where God does not dwell. Heaven is where God dwells. My answer to some folks would be, well, if for 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, you've had access to Christian friends, you've been able to read Christian books, you've been able to access the Bible, you've been able to go to a church where some of this message is taught, and consistently, day by day, willfully, given choice, you've rejected the God who's made loving overtures to you, wouldn't it be terrible then if he forced you to live in heaven with him? Just wouldn't seem just and right. And all God is doing is really rubber stamping the consistent choices that we've made over many years. That's why C.S. Lewis, in his book The Great Divorce, writing about this, said, in the end there are only two types of people. Those who say to God, your will be done, and those to whom God says, your will be done. Then the third thing that Jesus taught in terms of God's answer to the problem of suffering is that God offers help, or what the New Testament calls grace or support, which doesn't eradicate pain but ameliorates it. Here again, C.S. Lewis said this: what are you asking God to do? Wipe away past sins and at all costs give a fresh start, smooth over every difficulty and offer miraculous help? He did that at the cross, and he'll only meet you there. Well, I must conclude because my time is up. Just may I conclude by the last section about the question of response. How do we respond? Because the issue for us is not just where does suffering come from and why are we suffering? Why is suffering in the world? The reality is that it exists. And we have to ask, if there's a God, how does he deal with it? He deals with it through the cross, the resurrection, and the grace or the support he offers to people going through painful experiences. But then we need to respond. And often it's more difficult for somebody who doesn't believe there's a God who is there to work out a response. Because if there's no God, if you're coming from an atheistic framework and there's no God to blame, you still have to face the problem of suffering. Who are you going to blame? And it's important to face up to that question. I would suggest, I've only heard 5 responses possible, or observed 5. The first is to turn away in bitterness. I think we all have what I would call fork experiences in life, where we face adversity, whether it's when we're young or old, and there are 2 options: to go the way of bitterness or the way of beauty. But bitterness is a one-way street with no exit. It's a black hole. It's a bottomless pit. It doesn't help, and it leads to hardness. Now, some people go in that direction. That's why Albert Camus said this: atheism is a bitter cup and a bitter experience, and I've drunk it to the end. What if I were to close my eyes and all I can see is darkness? And imagine that if there is no God who is there, that's how I'm left, to face adversity and suffering without the light of his presence. Second option is despair. That's what Sartre talked about, the great French philosopher. When I was living in Paris in the 80s, he was still teaching, and he talked about the human dilemma as being no exit. There's no way out. And he pushed atheism to its logical conclusion from his perspective in saying man is absurd, but he must act as if he's not. But some of the students he was teaching, who saw the implications of this, said, well, if man and life is absurd, what's the point of continuing? Might as well commit suicide. So they did. I saw some of them jumping off the bridges or into the River Seine and committing suicide coming out of Sartre's lectures. Because their conclusion, pushing his philosophical worldview to its logical conclusion, was if there's no exit, despair is the repercussion, we might as well end it. The great English poet John Donne also put it this way: despair is suffering without meaning. The third option is stoicism. In some ways this issues out of Dawkins' viewpoint, which leads to deadening of emotions. If we say, well, it's just blind, pitiless DNA. Some get lucky, some don't. The problem with this is, you may have experienced this, it's hopeless pastorally. If you live with someone who is experiencing pain and is dying slowly, you try sitting next to them by the bedside and saying, well, this is just blind, pitiless DNA. You had bad luck of the draw. I sat next to my mother with brain cancer for 5 months every day. I could not imagine saying to her, well, it's been good to know you. You just had a bad luck of the draw. It's just blind, pitiless DNA. But that's the implication of such a worldview. The fourth worldview, which is how most of us live, is we live for the moment. And Jesus spoke about this. On one occasion he said to his disciples, don't call anybody a fool. It's really offensive and it's disrespectful, really, of human dignity. But there was one occasion when he taught a parable, he called one person a fool. It's a man who kept on building more and more barns and adding things up. And Jesus said to him, you fool, today your life will be required of you. We won't always be young, beautiful and healthy. Some of us are not 2 of those already, maybe even 3. But our tendency to live for the moment is short term. The last option I would put to you is that we can trust that what God reveals in the Bible is the most fruitful and satisfying answer to the problem of suffering. It doesn't only give us a substantial answer as to why it occurs, but what God has done about it and the hope we can have from trusting in him in this life. And I commend to you, therefore, the teaching of Jesus and a response to him, because he warned us of a way of escape, We need him. We have restless hearts. Because of what he's done for us in going to the cross, he didn't need to. And because of what some of your friends have experienced. And maybe after today, after the lunch bar, you'd like to engage with some of your Christian friends. If you're not yet a Christian, you're thinking things through, and ask them, well, what is this hope that you have? Please share it with me and tell me how it's buttressed or transformed your life. I think I better stop there because time is nearly gone, and take time for a few questions if we may. So I don't know if any have come up on the...
Yeah, so just to say, if you need to go, feel free to just get up and go, don't worry. But we are going to do some questions now. So this is one we've had, well, already. This person asked, my father died, and as far as I know, he wasn't a Christian. And if I become one, is that meaning that I will be forever separated from him? How does that feel?
Can I just say, if you are leaving, by the way, we'd really appreciate it if you could fill in this response form and tell us how we can do better, or there are opportunities for folks to come and discuss these kind of questions from next Monday, so we can get in contact with you. Well, what if I'm considering the possibility of becoming a follower of Jesus Christ, and one of my family members has died, and there's the reality of separation from God? How would you respond? What would you say to me? Perhaps 4 or 5 biblical truths or principles. The first is that God is fair in his execution of justice. Even some of us begin to doubt the justice of the British judiciary system. You may have seen on television or the newspapers recently of judicial judgments that have come down, and it makes the law look like an ass. It seems unjust. I remember a story of a butcher in South Wales whom I knew, who didn't care for the meat he was producing, sent it to a local school. A lot of the kids got problems as a result. Several died. And because he had a good barrister, he got off with 6 months in prison. Whereas I've seen other people who absconded with £5,000 and they were in prison for 10 years. Seems unjust. But if you read the Old Testament, King David says this: "Rejoice, for the Lord your God will judge with equity." So God reveals himself as someone who doesn't show favoritism to people, but judges fairly. Secondly, the Bible teaches that God is not willing that any man should perish. It's a very important distinction in the Bible, where God says he delights in loving. It never says he delights in judging. He judges because he's created a moral universe. But his delight is to see all men and women come to the knowledge of himself and salvation. And Jesus even wept over Jerusalem in saying, "Jerusalem, I would have gathered you together like a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not." Thirdly, we can't see into people's souls. So we don't know ultimately what parents and others who are close to us, even if we think we knew them fairly well, we don't know what they've decided, especially towards the end of their lives. Fourthly, God respects human choice and will not force people to live with him if they have decided they don't want to all through their lives. And he respects that and affirms it. But he does clearly say, as Jesus did, there's no second chance. And finally, knowing what Jesus taught, we each of us have responsibility to make a choice ourselves and respond one way or another to his teaching. I think that's about as far as the Bible could go without us trying to be a prophet or do what Job's friends did in trying to ascribe the causes of his suffering and make judgments on him. The New Testament says that if anybody calls on the name of the Lord, he will listen and he shall be saved. That's an absolute promise from God, and so absolute it's repeated 3 times. And we just have to leave that and trust God, if he is just and if he's true and faithful, to fulfill the promises which he has made, that if anybody at any time in life calls upon him, he shall be saved. There may be some surprises, therefore, as we get to heaven. But in the meantime, while we are here, we need to respond.
So I could be wrong. I think this is 2 texts from the same person, so I think it's an expanding on the question they're asking. But is it still necessary for hell to exist, since Jesus said on the cross, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do? Mm-hmm. Since he forgave everyone who did not believe he is the Son of God, and God is not arbitrary, God forgave every human being of that same sin?
Yeah, the problem is that you take away human choice then. In terms of the choices, as I mentioned, that we make consistently through our lives. It just wouldn't be appropriate, if God is a just God, to force us to live with him in forever. If our consistent choices day after day over 30, 40, 50, 60 years are that we want nothing to do with him. And by definition, heaven is where God dwells. Hell is the absence of the presence of God. Why should God force people to live in heaven with him if all through their lives have said, we don't want anything to do with you? Surely a consistent atheist would say, that's a fair deal. That's fair enough. I don't want anything to do with him, and I don't really want him to have anything to do with me if he exists. That's my choice, and I live with the consequences and the responsibility of it.
That's my question. You're trying to get an intuitive response to what is a theological question. If Jesus wasn't forgiven for that sin, what was he forgiven for? And why can it just be intuitive when intuitively there shouldn't be a hell at all?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Jesus' response was that when he was dying on the cross, he was taking the penalty of our sin upon himself. But he's requiring us to make a response. And consistently, when he was asked how we should respond, he talked in terms of the 2 keys being repenting, turning away from running our lives our own way, completely independent of God, declaring unilateral declaration of independence, turning around and receiving him or trusting him. And he consistently made out there was no other way to experience forgiveness. And it was conditional on us responding. It was an unconditional offer to all men and women, but the condition is that we are called to respond appropriately. And he was very crystal clear in stating that time after time. He stated it wasn't his wish that anybody should be separated, but he wouldn't force people to believe.
On the cross there is no faith condition. He just says, forgive them for they know not what they do.
Mm-hmm.
He forgives them without any condition.
Sorry, did you want to comment on that?
That them could mean only the people who are crucifying him and not the world at large, only for the given.
Well, that would make God arbitrary. That would mean that God forgives people on the basis of their geographic position and period of time.
Not only position for the event, like he might be telling, forgive them for they do not know what they are doing. What are they doing? They are crucifying him. Who are they? The Romans and the people.
Therefore, the fact that they don't know he's the Son of God isn't a sin, it's actually a defense, it's a mitigating factor in the sin which is killing God.
Can you ask repeat that?
Thank you. This is a very helpful dialogue, and I think it would be good if we could continue the dialogue after. Whether he was speaking specifically about the people at the time of the cross, or more generally, globally, the consistent promise of the Bible, even to people who have not heard the totality of the Christian message about Christ. Elsewhere in the Bible, God speaks to those who have not heard of Christ. They have some revelation through the creation they see, the starry skies above, their conscience. And also God says, if you call upon me, 3 times he says it, I will hear you. And I will respond. So that's as far as his promise goes. Whether people were living at that time or another time, or whether they were geographically dispersed in other parts of the world. And there are some remarkable stories we don't have time to go into, but I can share with you afterwards if you want, of people in geographical areas of the world who are not in connection with churches or with Christian missionaries, and called out to God, and somehow he connected with them on the basis of their cry for help, and gave them the gift of faith according to what they'd experienced, and a taste of his grace, his unreserved mercy and favour. Happy to dialogue with both of you perhaps together afterwards about that if you wish. Somebody else's?
I think we're going to have to wrap it up now.